The other day I was watching a documentary about Bob Dylan called No Direction Home by Martin Scorsese, and they were telling the story of how when he was a little kid, at his childhood home in the attic, he found a record player. He dusted it off and he played a record, and he realized, he says, that was it. That he knew in that moment that he was gonna be a musician, that it had grabbed him in such a visceral way. So he taught himself how to play the piano, he taught himself how to play the guitar, and he eventually, at the age of 18 or 19, he decides, I'm gonna move to New York City, I'm gonna give this music thing a shot, I'm gonna really give it a go. So he packs up a backpack and he grabs his acoustic guitar and he starts hitchhiking to New York City. And he eventually finds his way to Greenwich Village. And now Greenwich Village at the time, in the early 60s, was the epicenter of bizarre artistry, right? So you had these beat poets, you got Allen Ginsberg coming in, you got these performance artists, folk singers like Bob Dylan. They're all converging in this one small area of New York. And so he starts picking up different gigs and he's playing backup for different singers, just trying to cobble together money to survive, basically. I can only imagine someone coming and visiting Greenwich Village at that time and going to see another artist, and Bob Dylan would have been in the back playing backup guitar or something, or singing in the back, never realizing that that would eventually be one of the most influential folk singers in our history, just trying to make sense of his journey. So he starts meeting people in the Greenwich area, and he meets this guy named Izzy Young, and Izzy Young runs an area called the Folklore Center. And this was kind of the place to be if you were into folk music. Bob Dylan was very much ingrained in that world at the time. So he goes to Izzy Young and he says, let me play you a song. And Izzy Young is like, get in line, kid. Like, there's a lot of people that want to play me songs. Like, just no. Bob Dylan comes back the next day, let me play you a song. Day after day, he just kept coming back and sort of pestering Izzy. And finally, he goes, fine, play me something. So Bob Dylan plays him a song. He goes, I have some friends who are record producers. I think you might be able to create a record. I think you might be able to put a record together. And so as a musician, this is it. This is you sort of making it, or this is what you hope for. You want to make a record, you want people to listen to it, and you want to make a name for yourself. So Izzy takes him to this place called Folkways Record, and Bob Dylan takes his guitar and he plays for these guys, and one after another they go, no thanks, not for us, weird voice, strange style, no thanks. So finally, the last place that they're going to is a place called Vanguard Records, run by a guy named Maynard Solomon. And they play for Maynard Solomon, and he listens to it, and he turns to Bob Dylan and he says, we don't record freaks, and sends him on his way. The next day, Bob Dylan, I can only imagine he was probably crashing on one of his friends' couches and going to bed that night and thinking, I'm delusional. Nobody wants me to make music except for me. The next night he gets up and he goes and he plays at this little bar called Gertie's in New York. And in the back of the bar, there's this guy sitting in the back. His name's John Hammond. And he is a record producer for a little company called Columbia. And he listens to Bob Dylan and he's like, there's something here. So he goes up to Bob Dylan that night and he says, I want to cut a record with you. So he goes from complete and utter rejection to staring down his rejection, playing that night and getting this opportunity. So he cuts a record and he takes a bunch of old folk songs and he covers all of these songs. So he's doing a bunch of cover songs basically for his first album. And this first album is called Bob Dylan. So they cut it. The head of Columbia Records listens to it and he's like, I don't hear it. I don't really know what you're hearing, but this is not working for me. So they cut the album, they release it, and it flops. Horrible album in terms of sales. No one buys it. And so at this point, this is the point in the story where Bob Dylan should really pack his stuff up and go home. He should go back to Minnesota and be like, I tried, I did my best. But instead what he does is he grabs a pen and a piece of paper and he starts writing his own songs. He starts writing his first original songs. And that turns into his first album, his second album, but his first album with his own original music on it. And the first song on that album is Blown in the Wind. And That song is one of the most covered songs in our history. And that was the beginning of the rest of Bob Dylan's career. That's what led to the Bob Dylan that toured the world. That is the Bob Dylan that we are talking about right now. The one that made an impression on an entire generation. The same Bob Dylan that shared a microphone with Martin Luther King during the March on Washington. A significant member in the history of America. And so if there's anything that we can take away from Bob Dylan's story, is that there is no such thing as other people's version of your success. There's only your version of your success. And you get to decide how persistent you want to be. You get to decide how consistent you want to be. And you get to decide how much you press on in the face of adversity. And I think now more than ever, it's important for us to press on in the face of adversity, whatever that might be. And it takes on different shapes and different forms for everybody. But I think that if Bob Dylan can get rejected as hard as he set out to make his career come to life, that should give us a little bit more strength to press on in the face of our adversity.